Did you know that back in the 19th century, Afghanistan actually beat the British Empire not just once, but 3 times? Talk about a history of resisting foreign powers.
Absolutely. Yeah, quite the track record. And that history, that resilience, it's really crucial for understanding what we're diving into today.
Which is the Soviet-Afghan War, ran from 1979 to 1989.
Exactly. And we're going to try and unpack, the historical side, the societal, sociological, economic bits, even some of the military and business aspects for you. It's a really complex conflict.
Okay, let's get into it. Because interesting, the Soviets themselves, initially, they were really hesitant about jumping in directly.
Oh, very hesitant.
Yeah.
Back in March 79, the Afghan leader Taraki actually asked for Soviet troops, boots on the ground.
And they said no.
Adamantly no. The Politburo was pretty clear. They worried, and this is fascinating, they worried about causing, quote, bitter resentment among Afghans. And they knew, barging into someone else's civil war. Well, that's a massive propaganda win for your opponents in the Cold War, isn't it?
Definitely. Plus, I read they kind of thought Afghanistan just wasn't strategically vital enough.
Sort of, yeah.
Right.
You look at it from their perspective, weak economy, unstable government, population known for resisting outsiders. It just looked like a potential quagmire, a no-win situation, really.
But then something changed pretty dramatically between, May and December of 79?
Yeah, a complete turnaround. Moscow decides, okay, we're sending in the troops. Now, the exact why is still debated, but there are some pretty compelling theories for you to consider.
Okay, like what tipped the scales?
Well, one big thing was the Afghan government itself. It was looking increasingly shaky. The Soviets were genuinely worried it might just collapse.
Okay. Internal stability was a concern.
A major concern. And then you've got the Iranian Revolution happening right next door. Suddenly there's this radical Islamic theocracy in power.
Right. And the Soviets worried about that spreading.
Exactly. Spreading into their own Muslim-majority republics in Central Asia. That was a serious fear for them. So it wasn't just Afghanistan's internal mess. It was these, external regional pressures, too.
That makes a lot of sense. A kind of domino effect right on their border.
Precisely. And then you layer on the whole Taraki Yemen situation. Taraki gets murdered, replaced by Hafizullah Amin. And the Soviets, well, they deeply distrusted Amin.
Why? What was the issue with Amin?
They suspected him, and this later seemed to be based on KGB disinformation. Interestingly, they suspected he had secret links to the U.S. Embassy. Maybe he'd get a deal with the Americans. Classic Cold War paranoia,
Thinking the other side is behind everything.
Right, yeah. And sort of the final piece maybe was just the overall state of U.S.-Soviet relations. They were really souring.
Détente was basically dead by then.
Pretty much. You had NATO deciding to deploy new missiles in Europe because of the Soviet buildup, and then the U.S. Congress didn't ratify the SALT II Arms Control Treaty. So the feeling was, okay, this whole period of easing tensions, it's over.
So, wow, it's like a perfect storm brewing. You've got Afghan instability, the Iranian Revolution next door, this deep mistrust of the new leader, Amin, and the Cold War heating up again.
Exactly. It feels like they felt backed into a corner, maybe running out of options, and the situation inside Afghanistan under Amin, it was getting desperate.
How so?
His government had lost pretty much all credibility. The administration was chaotic. The secret police were brutal. His reforms were deeply unpopular. The economy was tanking.
And the religious angle.
Huge. The public largely saw the government as atheistic, anti-Islamic, which in a country like Afghanistan is, well, disastrous.
Not exactly winning hearts and minds, then.
Not at all. I mean, after just 20 months or so, life had gotten worse across the board. So the Soviets genuinely seemed to believe that if they didn't step in, Amin would be overthrown anyway.
And Afghanistan would be lost, as they saw it.
Yeah, lost to a regime that would likely be hostile to Moscow. They felt they had to intervene to prevent what they saw as a major strategic defeat in the Cold War.
Okay, so they make the call. December 1979. What happens when they actually move in?
Well, the initial entry was sort of this big operation, Baikal 79. The main goal was securing key sites in and around Kabul.
And did that go smoothly?
Mostly in Kabul itself. The Soviet 105th Airborne managed to disarm a lot of the Afghan army units there without too much trouble. But then, January 1st, 1980, at the Bala Hizar fortress, things went wrong.
Bala Hizar, what happened there?
Soviet paratroopers went to disarm the Afghan 26th Airborne Regiment stationed there. Standard procedure, they thought. But the Afghan soldiers refused. They actually opened fire on the Soviets. A really fierce firefight broke out.
Wow. So direct resistance right away.
Yes. And tragically, the Soviets, with superior firepower, essentially wiped out the Afghan regiment. Something like 700 Afghan paratroopers were killed or captured. It was brutal.
That's, yeah, a horrific start. What did that signal to the Soviets?
It showed them this wasn't going to be the easy stabilization mission they might have hoped for. That resistance right there in Kabul was unexpected and intense.
What were the immediate consequences of that Bala Hisar clash?
Well, the 26th Afghan Airborne Regiment was just completely disbanded, gone. Later reorganized, but yeah. And significantly, for you listening, the Soviets then permanently stationed one of their own airborne regiments, the 357th Guards, right there at Bala Hisar.
So they dug in.
They dug in. And they also set up 2 new Afghan commando brigades, basically under their direct supervision in Kabul. Shows how, even that early, the plan wasn't quite going as expected.
Okay, so the Soviets are in, facing immediate violent resistance. How did the wider Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, react? What were their tactics?
Classic guerrilla stuff, mostly. Sabotage was huge. It hit power lines, pipelines, radio stations, government offices, anything to disrupt the regime in the Soviets.
Keep them off balance.
Exactly. And especially near the border with Pakistan, they were firing rockets constantly, sometimes reportedly up to 800 rockets a day into towns and government positions. Just a relentless barrage.
800 a day. That's incredible pressure.
Absolutely relentless. And of course, landmines. Everywhere. A huge danger for everyone, soldiers and civilians alike.
And you mentioned a particularly dangerous tactic.
Yeah, they would often set up their firing positions, like for mortars or rockets, very close to villages.
Why do that?
Well, it made it harder for the Soviets to retaliate without hitting civilians. But of course, it put those civilians in immense danger from Soviet artillery or airstrikes if the Soviets did retaliate. It's a grim feature of asymmetric warfare, isn't it?
It really is. It paints this picture of a decentralized, messy, brutal fight. Which brings us to Afghanistan itself, the society. How did its structure play into all this?
Oh, fundamentally. I mean, Afghanistan is incredibly diverse ethnically, mostly Sunni Muslim, but crucially, it's very rural. Literacy rates were low. And the central government historically just hasn't had a strong grip.
Local loyalties matter more.
Massively more. The key unit is often the Quam. It's sort of a kinship group, could be a tribe, a clan, an ethnic subgroup, even just people linked by local interests. That's where primary loyalty often lies, much more than with some distant government in Kabul.
So trying to impose control from the center is always tough.
Always. There's this deep-rooted historical resistance to central authority, and especially to foreign interference. It's baked into the social fabric. And, for you trying to understand this, the Soviet failure to really grasp this decentralized, Quam-based society was a major, major miscalculation. They underestimated the depth of potential resistance.
And the geography, I mean, just looking at a map, it looks like a nightmare for a conventional army.
An absolute nightmare. You've got the massive Hindu Kush and Peloponnesus Mountains cutting across the country. Conventional warfare, forget it in many areas.
Natural fortresses.
Exactly. Then the Suleiman Range along the Pakistan border. Difficult, yes, but also a key route for movement. Later, crucial for the Mujahideen supply lines from Pakistan.
And the rest.
Deserts in the south and west, limiting where you can even deploy large numbers of troops. And the infrastructure.
Roads.
Very poor. A limited paved highway ring connecting major cities, but even that had issues. Bottlenecks, easily blocked, especially in winter. Logistics, just moving supplies and troops, was a constant grinding challenge for the Soviets.
So the Soviets walked into a country that was not only socially resistant, but geographically hostile to their kind of warfare.
Yeah.
And was there already fighting before they arrived?
Oh, yes, definitely. This wasn't a stable country they intervened in. Starting in 78, 79, you already had armed uprisings popping up across the country.
What behind those?
A mix. Some were driven by fundamentalist religious groups reacting against the Marxist government's policies. Others were ethnic minorities like Tajiks or Uzbeks, seeking more autonomy from the Pashtun-dominated center.
So multiple resistance movements already active?
Yes. And they'd started forming these Islamic committees in some areas, basically running things locally, parallel to the government. They were even laying siege to some major provincial cities before the Soviets showed up. The government's grip was already slipping badly.
Okay, so the Soviets are now fully committed, facing this widespread, rooted resistance in tough terrain. How did their actual military operations evolve?
Well, they initially sort of divided into phases. That first bit, December 79 to February 80, was just about getting in, setting up garrisons, getting organized. But as we saw with Bala Hisar, they were taking casualties almost immediately.
Even just sitting in their bases?
Yeah. Lieutenant Colonel Mamikin, who was there early on, recalled how they were mostly stuck in garrisons initially, not meant to be actively fighting, but they were getting shot at, having to return fire, losing people.
And the Afghan government they installed, under Karmal, wanted them to do more.
Definitely. Karmal's government didn't really trust its own army to handle the insurgency. Desertion rates were high, morale was low, so they pushed Moscow pretty hard to get Soviet forces more directly involved in combat.
So the Soviets got pulled deeper in faster than planned?
It seemed so. The idea that the Afghan army would do the heavy lifting just didn't pan out. Officially, the Soviets maintained it was the Afghan army's job to defeat the bandits, as they called them. But in reality, they quickly moved to combined operations, Soviet and Afghan troops fighting together.
Were they trying to improve the Afghan army?
They were. They put a lot of effort into trying to build up the DRA forces, improving discipline, trying to stop desertions. Interestingly, they even tried incorporating religious elements, like creating positions for mullahs within military units.
Trying to counter that atheist government image.
Exactly. Trying to adapt, maybe co-opt some religious feeling, though it seems it wasn't very successful overall. It shows the contradictions they were facing.
So what kinds of specific tactics did the Soviets use against the Mujahideen?
They developed a range of combined arms tactics. Raids were common. Go in fast, hit a specific target, a base, a leader's compound, gather intel, destroy stuff, capture people, get out. Speed, surprise, coordination were key. There's an example of a Major Pivovarenko leading a successful raid early on.
Okay, and stopping the Mujahideen moving around.
That involved blocking actions, using ground troops, often inserted by helicopter air assault units, to seize mountain passes, roads, key terrain, basically to fence the enemy in or prevent them from escaping an area. The fighting around La Carrosa Mountain is an example of that.
And cordon and search, we hear that term a lot.
Yeah, classic counterinsurgency tactic. Surround an area, like a village or a valley, then sweep through it looking for fighters, weapons, supplies. Its success really depended on how fast they could seal the area off.
Were there problems with that?
A big one was looting. Reports suggest both Soviet and DRA troops often looted homes during these searches. That obviously created huge resentment and probably pushed more people towards the Mujahideen. It undermined any hope of winning local support.
Yeah, that would definitely backfire. What else? Ambushes.
Absolutely. Ambushes were crucial for hitting Mujahideen supply lines, disrupting their movements, taking out personnel. They had set up complex ambushes with different groups, firing groups, snatch groups to grab prisoners or documents, security elements, observers.
With backup ready?
Often, yeah. They'd have helicopters on alert, a quick reaction force ready to jump in if needed. And convoy escort, that was a constant, dangerous job. Mujahideen loved hitting supply convoys. So the Soviets used armored vehicles, tried to secure the roadsides ahead of the convoy, but it remained a huge vulnerability.
It sounds like a constant grind. What about the equipment they were using for all this?
Their main APC, the BTR series, actually proved pretty robust and effective in the mountains, despite the tough conditions. They also had the BMP infantry fighting vehicles, the BMP-1, and later the BMP-2, which had heavier guns, useful for direct fire support.
And personal weapons.
The SVD sniper rifle was important, very effective against Mujahideen snipers, who often used the high ground. Officers usually had Makarov pistols. For machine guns, the RPK was common, and later the RPK-74 came in, using the same smaller 5.45 millimeter ammo as the standard AK-74 rifle, which helped with logistics.
Any heavier infantry weapons that stood out?
The AGS-17 automatic grenade launcher. They nicknamed it Plumia Flame. It fired 30-millimeter grenades rapidly, great for suppressive fire, and it was relatively portable, could be carried by a crew or mounted on vehicles. A very useful weapon in that terrain.
And protection, body armor.
Initially, the flak jackets they had weren't really up to scratch against rifle fire or heavy shrapnel, so later in the war they introduced heavier, more effective body armor that offered much better protection, though it was also heavier and harder to wear.
Did they adapt their training for this kind of war? It wasn't like fighting NATO on the plains of Europe?
No, definitely not. They did recognize the need to adapt. They started running more intensive training courses for commanders, focusing specifically on counter-guerrilla tactics, better reconnaissance, coordinating air and artillery support, even basic stuff like driving skills for the rough Afghan roads. The courses got longer and more specialized as the war went on.
So, learning on the job, essentially. But you mentioned intelligence earlier as a weakness. Can you expand on that? Were they getting good information?
That seems to have been a persistent problem.
Yeah.
They leaned very heavily on aerial recon planes, helicopters, and radio intercepts. Which is fine, up to a point.
But not enough.
Not enough for this kind of war. You've got small groups of mujahideen moving through mountains, blending in with locals. Aerial photos and radio chatter only tell you so much. They didn't seem to effectively use their own ground reconnaissance units or their Spetsnaz special forces for gathering that crucial human intelligence, that ground-level picture.
So they could fight, but they didn't always know who or what they were fighting accurately.
Exactly. And compounding that was their whole ideological framework. Soviet doctrine saw this as a war of national liberation, where they were helping the rightful government fight counter-revolutionaries. They just couldn't seem to grasp that this was a widespread popular uprising against the communist state itself.
They misread the whole situation, fundamentally.
It seems so. They couldn't understand the religious motivation, the nationalism, the tribal loyalties driving the resistance. This flawed understanding really hampered their strategy. And back home, the Soviet media just suppressed the truth about how badly things were going for years, which created this huge disconnect and, eventually, massive public disillusionment when the casualties mounted and the stories started trickling out. They fundamentally misunderstood their enemy.
A recipe for disaster, really. So with all these military struggles, the intelligence failures, the flawed understanding, what finally pushed them out? What led to the withdrawal after a decade?
A confluence of factors, really. But probably the single most important was Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in 1985. His new thinking, glasnost, perestroika. That changed everything.
Oh, so?
Gorbachev saw the war as a massive drain. Economically, it was crippling the already struggling Soviet economy. Politically, it was terrible for the Soviet image abroad. He wanted to reform the Soviet Union, ease Cold War tensions, and Afghanistan was just this bleeding wound, this huge obstacle.
So internal pressures were key. What about internationally?
Big time. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, signed with the U.S. in '87, showed a real desire to de-escalate. And crucially, China. Beijing made it crystal clear to Gorbachev, if you want normal relations with us, you have to get out of Afghanistan.
China's influence was that strong.
It was a major condition, and Gorbachev really wanted that normalization. It led to the first Sino-Soviet summit in 30 years, which happened in 1989, right after the withdrawal was complete. So, yeah, China played a big role.
Interesting. So it wasn't just the U.S. applying pressure.
No. And this was part of a bigger shift in Soviet foreign policy under Gorbachev. They started pulling back elsewhere, too, supporting withdrawals from Angola, Mongolia, putting pressure on Vietnam to leave Kampuchea. It was a general move away from costly foreign interventions.
Okay, and what about the military situation on the ground? The Stinger missiles. You always hear about the Stingers. Were they the game changer?
Ah, the Stingers. They're iconic, aren't they? Provided by the U.S. Did they single-handedly win the war? Probably not. If you just look at the raw numbers of aircraft shot down, there wasn't this sudden massive spike in losses right after they arrived.
But they still had a big impact.
Oh, a huge impact, psychologically and tactically. The threat of Stingers forced the Soviets to completely change how they used their air power, especially helicopters.
How so?
Helicopters had to fly much higher, making them way less effective for close air support or precise attacks. They had to cut back drastically on daytime flights, rely more on riskier night operations. Every Soviet aircraft needed electronic countermeasures. Their pilots became much more cautious.
So it degraded their air advantage significantly.
Exactly. It didn't eliminate it, but it severely hampered the effectiveness of Soviet air power, which had been one of their key advantages over the Mujahideen. So the Stinger effect was very real and strategically important, even if the kill counts weren't astronomical.
Got it. So multiple pressures converging, Gorbachev's reforms, the economic cost, international isolation, pressure from China, and the degrading military situation with things like the Stingers. What were the final costs, the consequences of this decade of war?
Devastating. Just devastating. First, you have the incredibly serious allegations of Soviet war crimes, widespread killings of civilians, destruction of villages, reprisal attacks. Some scholars and groups even argue the scale and systematic nature amount to genocide against parts of the Afghan population. These are extremely grave charges.
Wow.
It is. And internationally, as we touched on, it was this massive Cold War proxy fight. The Mujahideen got support from Pakistan, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, China, others. But it's also crucial for you listening to remember the private donations. Huge amounts of money and volunteers flowed in from across the Muslim world, often exceeding government aid. It showed how deeply resonant the Afghan cause was.
A truly globalized conflict in many ways. What about the human cost for the Soviets themselves?
It was immense and deeply scarred Soviet society. The official numbers are stark enough. Over 13,000 killed or died of wounds, almost 54,000 wounded or injured, and over 415,000 soldiers fell sick with things like hepatitis, typhoid. The conditions were brutal.
And lasting effects.
Huge numbers of veterans left permanently disabled, physically and mentally. Hundreds listed as missing in action. And it's widely believed, that the official Soviet figures for Afghanistan, like for World War II, were likely undercounted. The true cost was probably even higher.
A terrible toll. And for the Afghan people.
An unimaginable catastrophe. Millions forced to flee as refugees, mainly to Pakistan and Iran, one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. The country was shattered, infrastructure destroyed, society traumatized, effects we still see today.
And that Soviet suspicion about Amin and the CIA, any truth to it?
Well, the CIA has always flatly denied having any meaningful contact or relationship with Amin before the Soviets invaded. So that key justification the Soviets used seems to have been, based on bad intelligence or deliberate disinformation. A tragic miscalculation.
Which brings us back to how we even describe this invasion, intervention.
Exactly. The language itself shows the divide. The West and the Mujahideen called it an invasion. The Soviets, their allies, the government in Kabul called it an intervention requested by Afghanistan. Even Amnesty International termed it a hostile invasion. It highlights those fundamentally different perspectives on its legitimacy.
So no easy answers, even on what to call it.
Not at all. And looking back, many analysts see the war as a major contributing factor to the Soviet Union's own collapse just a couple of years later. The cost, the disillusionment, the blow to prestige, it weakened the system profoundly.
And for the wider world?
For many in the Muslim world, the eventual Soviet withdrawal was seen as this huge victory, defeating a superpower. It was a massive morale boost, seen by some as a military victory for Islam after, centuries of colonialism and setbacks. Its ripple effects were enormous.
A truly pivotal moment in modern history, with consequences still unfolding.
Absolutely.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, we've looked at the Soviets' initial, maybe surprising, reluctance, then the reasons they went in, the sheer difficulty they faced against the Mujahideen in that terrain, the evolving tactics, the huge international angle, and the terrible costs, human, economic, political, for everyone involved, especially Afghans, but also for the Soviet Union itself.
What really stays with you, I think, is the long shadow this conflict casts. It forces you to think about the unintended consequences of foreign intervention, particularly when there's a failure to understand the local context, the history, the society, the deep-seated resistance.
Maybe the enduring lesson for you listening is just how hard it is for even a powerful conventional army to win against a determined, deeply rooted insurgency, especially in terrain like Afghanistan's, and how interventions can unleash forces and consequences that nobody predicts or intends. It definitely gives you a lot to chew on about history and international relations.
Indeed. And we really encourage you to keep exploring this crucial period. Look at the different viewpoints and think about its complex and ongoing legacy.